Hi everyone, this is our presentation about the implications for teaching and policy. After asking several questions to our peers, we have decided to challenge ourselves and answer one of them. The question is, how feasible is the adoption of the models in contemporary Colombia? Before we answer it, I'm going to explain the models that we've taken into consideration. The first model is exonormative native speaker model and is the choice that most outer and perhaps all expanding circle countries have made. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, native speaker models have prestige and legitimacy. They also have a long history and throughout many years they have been codified. It means that we have many tools to learn a language. We have grammar books, handbooks, exercise books, dictionaries, all the useful materials for both teachers and students. Codification also facilitates how students are tested and evaluated according to certain norms and standards. Choosing this model could also be beneficial because materials based on such models are easily available. Publishers are constantly creating new courses and reprinting successful old ones. The last reason for choosing a native speaker model is that ministries of education always try to provide the best option for the citizens. Well, in this case, it could be wrong because native speakers models are not always understandable in international communication. But still, ministries think that thanks to introducing such model, they uphold some higher standard and provide their citizens with the best variety of English. Now, let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of an exonormative native speaker model. It's important to mention first that they can be highly subjective, depending on which side of the barricade we are, because what is an advantage for one group could be a disadvantage for another. This model is financially beneficial for the American and British English language teaching industries. They sell materials, create courses and training, and develop international testing systems. Also, this model advantages the native speakers that have been in high demand in schools around the world. Sometimes being a native speaker is the only qualification required. Very often, without training or degree, they are continuously employed by schools, institutions, and universities. In some circumstances, this model is an advantage for students who have the opportunity to visit or study in inner circle countries, as they could benefit from acquiring knowledge of the culture and manners taught by a native speaker teacher. Now, some of the disadvantages. One of them is discrimination of the local teachers. This model undermines the value and legitimacy of a local teacher's own model of English. Also, these teachers have to teach a model that they don't even speak, and that can harm their self-confidence. They can also feel resentment when they are highly trained to be teachers, and there comes the day in which a school or an institution hires a native speaker who has no training whatsoever, but in spite of that, becomes an expert and a source of knowledge about the language and teaching it. And all of this is based only on being a native speaker. This model can also have a harmful effect on the students who realize that, for example, they will never achieve the level of a native speaker, for instance, when it comes to pronunciation skills. That can strongly demotivate them. The next model I am going to describe is endonormative nativized model. This model is used in the outer circle countries, and in those countries, the local variety of English is socially accepted. The advantages of this model could be, for example, recognizing and embracing multilingual competence. The local teachers are appreciated and empowered by having a chance to legitimize and exploit their model of English. It certainly increases their self-confidence and self-esteem. By being local, they can also advantage their students, since they understand the struggles students may have while learning a second language. It's something that monolingual native speakers could not understand. Another advantage is better financial distribution. The money that could be spent on higher salaries for the native speaker teachers is preferred to be spent on local teachers' training, courses, and materials, which results in highly qualified professionals. And the last advantage is culture protection. Some of the countries are very protective of their culture, and they don't really tolerate foreigners bringing their own manners, beliefs, or traditions. This model definitely protects the culture that is more conservative. One disadvantage that this model could have is non-existent codification. It means that there are no materials to teach the local variety of English. However, there is a solution for that, and this solution is local teachers and other experts of English, who are qualified enough to prepare their own materials for the classes. Another model, or better say the approach, is lingua franca, where English is used as a medium of communication between people whose native language is different from English. It has several advantages. One of them is cross-cultural communication. It allows both students and teachers to open their minds for diversity and respect to other cultures. The second advantage is the fact that materials are hard to codify. It means that none of the countries can own the language, it's denationalized, and no one can really get a financial benefit out of it. And at last, lingua franca has got attainable and appropriate standards. Students don't need to feel that they will never achieve this native speaker level. They can be satisfied when they get to the level when they can communicate with others easily, no matter pronunciation. And now, some of the disadvantages. Some people could say that multiculturalism doesn't bring any benefits, but only damages the cultures and traditions. Also, there are two negative results of applying the lingua franca approach, which are linguistic imperialism and linguistic genocide, and one could actually lead to the other. While the English language spreads across the world, it could cause disappearing of certain languages or dialects.
How feasible is the adoption of the models in contemporary Colombia? Raúl Alberto Mora, in 2013, discusses the common understanding there is about ESL and EFL. ESL is English learnt in the country where it is used officially, and EFL where it is not. He calls this language ecologies and considers this problematic as they do not accurately represent the language-related policy in Colombia. Alberto Mora discusses numerous issues with regard to language ecology. First, the definition of foreign itself is associated with negative connotation, or something that does not belong to me, which he believes is ambiguous, as English nowadays has no ownership. Another issue is the fact that EFL and ESL are always measured against that of native speakers. Thus, the closer one leans towards that native ideal, the better, more qualified a speaker one would be. Another issue has to do with the geographical location as a source of distinction. However, the rise of access to information and language learning resources via the internet has decentralized learning. And finally, as is the case in Colombia, social stratification is an issue, because here in Colombia, the so-called privileged students can have access to state-of-the-art learning facilities, high-intensity exposure to English even in other subjects, and instruction from teachers brought in from inner-circle countries. Raúl believes that when you have schools with such plentiful resources, one cannot talk about foreign language anymore. What is happening instead is that second language instruction becomes a commodity that only a wealthy few can afford. That said, Alberto Mora proposes the use of the term second languages as opposed to ESL and EFL for the following reasons. It acknowledges the diversity in language learning as it recognizes both physical and virtual approaches. It allows more control over language. So there's a much wider variety of language, and it also rids the notion of second languages being considered inferior to that of standards. Language learning should never come to the detriment of other languages users already possess. This includes their mother tongue. And finally, the relinquishment of ownership due to the ever-increasing forms of authorship and language use that the Web 2, ICT, and the digital world keep offering.
To continue with the feasibility of adopting the models in the contemporary Colombia, we have to speak of how world lingua franca and international Englishes would or should affect policy and teaching. As it has been discussed previously by my peers and colleagues in different previous presentations, and this one particularly, to take into account such things, we need to consider the new challenge nowadays for ELT. It should indeed affect the language teaching policy all around the globe, and it is the ongoing current discussion. Because English is a dynamic language that has evolved, especially as it is not under the dominance of the native speakers anymore, but has been permeated by the local forces of other languages, where English has become the other language. Three famous models affect teaching and learning. Let's mention these three models in World Englishes. Strong's model in 1970s, English as a native language, English as a second language, and English as a foreign language. Then True's model in 1992 related these different levels to the three circles model. Then the dynamic model in 2003 and restated in 2007 by Schneider proposed non-native New Englishes which focus on the difference between reality and idealism. Dynamic approach to language proficiency, DALP, by Schneider. So let's continue talking about this. Mahoop explains that Edgar Schneider's dynamic model of the post-colonial Englishes adopts an evolutionary perspective emphasizing language ecologies, and it shows how language evolves as a process of competition and selection, and how certain linguistic features emerge. This dynamic model illustrates how the histories and ecologies will determine language structures in the different varieties of English, and how linguistic and social identities are maintained. For this, that there are 4 conditions for this to happen. Political history, first, identity rewriting language, second, determine linguistic conditions, and then linguistic conditions and this development in language. And 5 stages. Foundations, in which English brought to new territory to start bilingualism. Exonormative, the norms are provided by colonizer. Nativization, addition of native flavor in the language. Endonormative, making their own rules and grammar. And differentiation, which is the introduction of their own variety by Mahoop in 2018. The models affect teaching and learning. This viability of the different models is a worldwide discussion. The exonormative native speaker model is the one that has been currently happening around the world and in Colombia and the third circle. The implementation of this model is the one expected to be the norm and is therefore taught in classrooms and schools in Colombia. Then the endonormative nativized approach, where non-native bilingual teachers use English as a lingua franca. This happens in outer circles countries where the local variety of English is accepted. How affected can this be? During the last decades, the teaching of inner circle standard English in non-native countries has become the main focus of English language pedagogy. For instance, it is very evident in Colombia, where the Ministry of Education focuses the standards to the Common European Framework, which are aligned to the standards of native countries' policies. This decision has dramatically increased in the number of native-speaking teachers around the world, which brings attention and focus to the ESL and EFL approaches currently today in Colombia. Well then, the informal bilingual education could be a dynamic model for Colombia. Krashen, in 1985, describes informal language acquisition as a way of picking up a language subconsciously. Also, he described bilingual education as the one that creates a context in which an additional language is used as a medium of instruction in informal settings. He also proposed the idea of bilingual education as opposed to EFL and ESL. Then, formal bilingual learning is always intentional. We can see in this graph that the students are enrolled in courses for purpose of becoming bilingual. But the education that spurs informal bilingual acquisition could be first, planned or intentional, with speakers consciously wanting to acquire additional ways of communicating and being involved in activities that might be called supplementary education, or second, unplanned or intentional, with speakers becoming bilingual without explicit formal intent, simply by living and participating, which is what we call human education.